Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th edition of our FBF Discuss, which will focus on the following motion. This House believes that ESG disclosure will help us reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement. My name is Pierre Schlosser. I'm the Deputy Director of the Florence School of Banking and Finance at the Robert Schuman Center of the European University Institute. And I'm thrilled to be moderating this seminar today with so many of you participating. ESG disclosures have been on everyone's lips for quite some time now. It is obvious that all of us following policy developments, that disclosure is clearly a central element of both the EU sustainable finance strategy, but also of global initiatives that have all aimed to lead to a better understanding of ESG risks throughout the financial system, but also in the wider economy. To what extent can disclosure then have an impact is something that we will be discussing today. We at FBF are fascinated by this discussion. We're taking our mission of educating future leaders also in sustainable finance very seriously. And as a matter of fact, we will be looking at disclosure rules already next month as part of our EU sustainable finance regulation course. Something that is important to mention, the motion is having the Paris Agreement in its title. So for those of you who do not know what the Paris Agreement is, here is the elevator version of it extracted from the United Nations website. So the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties at COP21 in Paris, France, in December 2015. Its overarching goal is to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts, I quote, to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Let me now introduce our fantastic speakers of today. We have today with us Linda Zeilina. She's the founder and CEO of the International Sustainable Finance Center, where she oversees its work on sustainable investing and inclusive economies. Linda will be advocating today for the motion. Florian Berg is our second speaker. He's currently a research scientist at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he co-founded the Aggregate Confusion Project. Florian today will be against the motion. I'd like to thank them dearly. I didn't introduce you in too detailed terms, but for everyone interested in getting to know Linda and Florian better, just Google them. The format, so this is not a standard seminar. There is a very rigid, for those of you who participated already in the past, there is a very rigid choreography that will underpin our speakers' interventions of today. That will be also, let's say, structured also by the intimidating time clock, as our speakers will see. So in just a few minutes, we'll give the floor first to Linda for 6 minutes, then to Florian, then we'll make sure that every one of you have 3 minutes for a rebuttal, and we'll then open the floor for comments and questions. I noticed that some of you already submitted a few questions in the registration form, and then we'll give 3 minutes to each of our speakers for concluding remarks, and then I'll close off the seminar and make sure that at 2 o'clock we're all set. So another thing I didn't mention is that we'll have a series of polls during this session. The first one starting very soon before giving the floor to Linda for the first intervention. So I will close it here, make sure that we're going to have today together a great moment of intellectual stimulation, structured in the way that we indicated, and I'm looking forward also to engaging in the Q&A. As of now, the first poll question came up, and I will read it loud for this first one. I won't do it for the next ones. First question is, will ESG disclosure help us reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement? No big surprises here. I would like to maybe just give a second to participants to focus on the poll question, and then in 10 seconds give the floor to Linda. We have to adjust to this dynamic environment. Here we go. Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pierre, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I believe that there are three main reasons why ESG disclosures will be absolutely crucial for us to meet the Paris Agreement goals. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. That is actually data. So it will allow us to collect more data. So reason number one, what has actually ESG done? ESG disclosures have actually put environmental, social, and governance performance on the agenda. If years ago, we didn't even talk about it, now, when you went to the COP26 in Glasgow, you had so many stakeholders from business and finance discussing how actually can we do these disclosures, what is ESG in practice, and how can a business or a financial institution implement these disclosures. So now it is a topic of discussion. So that is absolutely crucial for us to start understanding it better, which leads to the second point. The second reason why ESG disclosures will help us change how business and finance operate is because just talking about it and having it on the agenda and having the stakeholder interest in it, from government to business to finance, drives more and more money and investment in research. I think Florian here is a great example of what that can offer us. It can offer us better understanding of what's working and what's not working. Without the money allocated to universities, research, and data gathering to figure out whether ESG is working or not, what are the most meaningful or comparable indicators, it is almost impossible to navigate this space. So that is absolutely needed, that we invest more money and time in understanding, in building up internal resources in business and finance institutions when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to methodologies, when it comes to data gathering, processes, and everything else. That brings me to the third point. Third point is that up until now, we have had multiple standards, loads of different things floating around. People report ESG according to GRI, Global Reporting Initiative. They can report it according to SASB and many, many other ways. So sustainability reports have not been very easily comparable. This is where I think it's crucial to remember that the European Commission is working on the EU taxonomy. We are undergoing a consultation period. There's an additional delegated act as well. So why does the taxonomy matter? Taxonomy is a very interesting development. Finally, the reporting and the indicators will be based on science. We need to set aside for now the nuclear and gas debate, because that was a bit of a shame that the political process intervened. But the technical screening criteria is actually based on the best scientific evidence that we have currently. If a business or a big financial institution reports according to the taxonomy criteria, then you actually know you have best-in-class reporting that is based on solid expertise and on something that is comparable. These kind of developments, such as the use of EU taxonomy, which will be mandatory, and it will actually underpin corporate sustainability reporting directive. It will also underpin financial institution reporting and investment community reporting under the SFDR, or the Sustainable Finance Reporting Initiative. Sorry, the acronyms even get to me sometimes. So the point is that in the land of acronyms, we are actually starting to get a little bit more coherence. Step by step, the situation will keep improving. Without having any ESG data, we are operating blind. We have no idea what kind of impact businesses have on the natural environment. We have no idea how to attribute the worst impacts of climate change to certain economic actors. So understanding how economic activities contribute to Paris Agreement, or whether they go against it, is absolutely necessary. And this is where I think that the growing transparency and the growing improvement in our scientific and research community, combined with also understanding how these things work in practice, will lead to unprecedented transparency. And for that, it will also lead to the next step, where we are not looking just at single materiality, as it has been the case up until now, when ESG ratings agencies and everybody else has been just looking at what are the risks to the business stemming from ESG. We are actually moving to a different paradigm where we are incorporating also impact. And impact means double materiality. That means also understanding how certain businesses affect the natural resources, or what is their contribution to carbon emissions. So this is why I believe that it will actually be very meaningful to have ESG disclosures. They play an absolutely crucial role in driving transparency, in helping policymakers, practitioners, and researchers understand how to improve and how to actually adjust the system to get to the Paris Agreement goals. And I believe that we are at the start of a very fascinating journey, without which we would never properly incorporate the so-called externalities of business operations that currently exist. And finally, let's also remember that all investors always operate in a space where they want to manage risk. And as we get more and more physical risk materializing, ESG disclosures will be very good for understanding which particular real estate operations, which particular investments are at the greatest risk of climate change. So having that element in the system will be very useful for long-term asset managers, long-term institutions such as pension funds. And those will be the key movers of the dial, trying to help us direct the capital so that we can actually have a transition to a net zero economy, which is aligned with the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and for sticking also perfectly to the time. So you said also on that a standard for Florian. I think that we have a poll coming in, the second one of today. So we'll just give a few seconds to the platform to project that. Yes, I think it's quite a mundane question, but important as a start. How useful are ESG indicators on the scale of 0 to 5, with 5 being very useful? And I think that we may pick up on some of those answers when we have the Q&A. So this wasn't to distract you anywhere, Florian. So please, the floor is yours. Same rule, 6 minutes. Please
Thank
go.
you, Pierre, for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me, and thank you, Linda, for taking the role of the proponent. So I will take the role of the opponent today, and I will argue that ESG disclosure will actually maybe get us away from reaching the Paris Agreement faster. And I think the main reason is because it will give us a false sense of achievement. And through that false sense of achievement, we will actually, it might crowd out regulation, or put differently, it might get us, since we believe that we're doing something, we will not engage in that one single thing that will help us the most to get us out of the mess, and that is a CO2 tax. And there are plenty of examples in different industries, such as the pharmaceuticals getting together, setting an industry standard just to avoid actually harder regulation afterwards. And this false sense of accomplishment is mainly based on the fact that we believe that ESG disclosure will necessarily translate into real-world change, real-world impact. And I will show you now through that this is actually, the main assumptions are that this is going through 3 channels. Basically, the investor channel, the management, the CEOs, or the consumer. And I would like to show you that all 3, it's not clear that this will actually translate into change. Starting with management, just because something gets measured doesn't necessarily mean it gets managed. There are examples, for example, of Walmart figuring out that their employees have a low living wage, and when they realize the high management, they change it. But this is certainly true anecdotally, but in a systematic way, I haven't come across that research that really shows that ESG disclosure will translate into real impact. The other channel is consumers. And here again, I haven't seen any research, and I also doubt that just because firms start now disclosing their CO2 emissions via CDP or via the sustainability reports, that consumers actually even have the time to sit down or get even data from third-party raters, rating agencies, for example, and then actually act accordingly, meaning they change their consuming behavior and they consume products with a lower carbon footprint from companies with a lower carbon footprint. But the main channel is actually what we call sustainable investing. And here again, there are massive problems, especially because I think there's huge confusion between investor and firm impact. So firm impact, for example, if you have a sustainable portfolio that you buy from a big asset manager, for example, where you buy into from a big asset manager, then you might hold a set of sustainable companies. But what you really want to do with your sustainable investing is you want to drive change. You want to drive change in the real world. And just because you own a stock doesn't necessarily mean that you drive change. The reason here is that, for example, I'm a sustainable investor. I buy a stock because of the company's low carbon footprint. But then Pierre, for example, is a traditional investor. And so he says, oh, wow, the price is very high now from that stock, so I sell it. So the stocks exchanged hands. Now the sustainable investors hold the sustainable stocks and the traditional investors hold the non-sustainable stocks, but there was no impact on the price. And so how does zero impact on the price can have an impact on the real world? Moreover, all these investors are mainly driven by alpha and by higher returns. And financial theory is very clear about the fact that if you have higher returns, you cannot achieve impact because you need this lower cost of capital mechanism. So a higher stock price that then translates into better financing for the company and that to a better impact or higher impact in the real world. But that would also, according to financial theory, tell you that you have to face lower expected returns. So the impact actually has a cost. And I think here, this is something, I don't know if I'm not so sure, or I really highly doubt that if this actually becomes more and common knowledge, that even retail investors want to invest in those impact funds. So again, I really don't see, so I think all those three transmission channels are flawed. And there's also very little research that actually shows that there might be systemic change via those three channels. Then there's another argument to be made, and that is that disclosure is costly, and it is a burden mostly on small, innovative companies. Smaller companies tend to create more innovation, and innovation is what should get us or will get us out of this mess. And so putting a burden on them and drawing resources away from actually the innovation process might actually slow down, actually real change. And here in my talk, I haven't even talked about the difficulties in measurement, but that might be actually come up in the Q&A. So again, my main argument is that ESG disclosure crowds out regulation, and regulation is what we really need in form of a CO2 tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. So this is great. I think that we've launched the ping pong dynamics that we will continue along right now. We have a third poll coming up that goes a bit more into one jurisdiction. So I give you a few seconds to read the question and make up your mind. Great. And now I will give the floor to Linda for the first rebuttal. And then Florian will have the exact same opportunity, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Pierre. So first of all, whether disclosure itself alone leads to change, I think it depends. However, it is an underlying element that we need. Because while you're right that we have not been very good at managing everything that we measure, but if we don't measure, then we have no idea what's happening. And this means that also there is no scrutiny. And in this case, I think that actually some of the channels that are already working and that are driving some positive change, maybe not fast enough, but I think it's an element of that, and we're at the beginning of it, is that number one, ESG data no longer needs to be self-reported alone. There's more and more data providers and different technologies that enable us to get data that is not self-reported. For example, with satellites that are combined with lasers, there's the first 2 years of the European satellite system giving us data on the natural environment and its depletion that we have never had before. This is not something that a company can report itself. This means that you can get an additional data point seeing where geographically these particular facilities are located and what's happening with the soil erosion, what's happening with the trees, what's happening with the water. So there is more and more of that coming along. Even on social, you can look at how many non-disclosure agreements are registered and if they're correlated with the gender. That means that maybe you have some sort of social issue under the S. The same kind of indicators in the legal space and controversy research in media can show you also where there might be issues in the governance part. Also, how do we actually, how does the ESG data help, or what does it enable? But I think what it enables is actually more voting against directors when it comes to certain jurisdictions, such as the US. So all of a sudden, if you tie certain ESG performance that needs to then be verified by an auditor, if you tie that performance to a director's pay or performance or a bonus, all of a sudden, everybody's interested in driving this change. So it doesn't become just purely voluntary action in one of the GFANs or Glasgow Net Zero Alliance, etc. It doesn't become one of the initiatives that doesn't bite. It's actually very tangible. It's tied to your performance, your bonus, your money, and to your investor relations. That's for big companies. The same thing for also some investment funds. Some of them, their shareholders, their
Linda, we're losing you.
limited partners are actually asking questions. They know. Then finally, we have a big wealth transfer. A new generation is coming with different preferences, different values. They are usually the wealthiest, big investors that can drive preferences. The stewardship practices are also changing. So having more data and asking for more data is on the agenda. Finally, there's also going to be regulation on greenwashing. So you can't just report whatever. You actually face a risk of regulation there. Finally, under the EU taxonomy, you can also monitor taxonomy capital expenditures.
Thank you for, so there was a slight connection issue, Linda, but I think that we got the overall thread of your point. It didn't last very, just a few seconds. Here we go. So here, I wonder actually whether there is another poll or whether we wait for Florian's intervention as a second rebuttal to open the poll. I'll leave this to Chiara, who is managing our seminar. So Florian, please, your turn.
Thank you, Pierre. I think to get to your point with this CEO pay, the problem here is that we might set false incentives. And the reason is if we do not measure something perfectly, and what I mean by a perfect measure wouldn't be the CO2 emissions, because it's not really interesting how much CO2 or how much a company pollutes now, but it's more about what the intention is of the company. So will it actually, does it anything in their power, so to say, to reduce the CO2 emissions over time? And so if we then have a faulty, noisy measure and we set a target on that with CEO pay, then we might hit this target, but we actually miss the point of reducing those CO2 emissions in the future. I see a very big problem there, and there's still a lot of, we're talking about, there's more and more research about it, but there's actually quite a lot of research, again, here missing as well. The other thing is you talked about the EU taxonomy. So here, this is actually also a huge example of that we're still very early age in our thinking about how this works. It was what I said a little bit about this. Does actually sustainable investing have an impact? And when we look at the taxonomy, where then, for example, is very tied to the SFDR regulation, right, with Article 9 funds, so this very deep green funds, you see that even here, the European regulator has not understood the difference between actually having a certain owning companies that have impact and actually the impact of an investor, because it completely does not speak about investor impact. But the only thing what really gets us out is that investors actually put pressure on companies to create impact. So here, I think there is, there's a lot of more work done, and the time is very urgent. We need to do something now. And again, I'm scared that this will take us away from the really strong regulation, and that really helps, and that is a CO2 tax. Also, I do not really share your point of view with the double materiality that this is more and more adopted. Certainly you have EFRAG, right? You have in Europe, you have this big push. But when you look at investors, there's a quasi-monopoly of single materiality in the US. And I have the feeling anecdotally, and again, this is also not backed by research, that there are a lot of investors are more and more focused on return. So we still are before this process of separating ESG finance that is going for returns and sustainable finance that is going for impact. There's still this huge mix. So that will still take some time. I do agree, raising awareness. I concede that point. That raising awareness, we can go both ways. So I argue here in my first 6 minutes that we're crowding out regulation, but it could also be that we're raising awareness and we see it's not that costly, and then hence we will adopt regulation maybe. But I think the real question is regulation.
Thank you for that. So we're having another poll right now. And I would like to invite actually everyone on the seminar to start thinking about questions that you'd like to bring to the table. This is going to be the next moment in this interaction. So first, we have also the results of the first poll questions, which was, quite a 73% in favor, saying yes, ESG disclosure will help us. So that's good, because I think we're asking the right question, but there are still arguments on the other side that we're discussing right now. I can see also that there is a bit of activity in the Q&A box, but maybe to get us also started in terms of how to approach some of the questions that we're asking. I wanted to basically follow up on a question that was formulated in the registration stage, where someone from Brussels is mentioning that, of course, ESG disclosures are still under development and that there is a vast range of metrics and KPIs. So a question to the speakers is, which metrics would you consider most useful, and which ones would you prefer to have disappear over time? And then we'll make sure that we also elaborate on the other questions that are being formulated. I'm not sure who would like to, maybe we revert the order this time, so Florian and then Linda. If the question is not entirely clear, I'm happy to reformulate it.
Okay, this is more like, my answer will, I will base that more on my research. And so here I would say that it's not really necessarily the question of what should disappear and what is actually useful, because I think ESG disclosure is in the ecosystem is just a part. And there is something that by definition will always be missing in ESG disclosure. And that feeds in a little bit into the argument that it's very costly, all this, what we're doing, this measuring. So ESG disclosure is often like EFRAG, ISSB, SASB, GRI is about how we count data, right? So how we count CO2, Mr. Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But then what we really want to know, as I mentioned before, is we want to know what actually the intention of the company is, what they want to do with those CO2 emissions. Do they want to reduce it in the future or not? Are they taking that seriously? Also, often this data needs contextuality. So it matters where we pollute, maybe not with CO2 emissions, but with certainly with other toxic chemicals. Do we pollute upstream or downstream of a city? And so we need actually this will be actually impossible for ESG disclosure to be taken into account. So that's why we need ESG raters. So the question is more, I think we will see over time what we don't need or what we need, but yeah, it's just I guess that's a little bit my answer. It doesn't really 100% answer your question, but I think I want to give you maybe a different way of thinking about it. Thank you.
Linda.
The one point I do agree with Florian is that we do need the accompanying side of regulation and policy tweaks. Disclosure alone is not sufficient, that's for sure. But the interesting thing is, I think what disclosure does help to do is for us to understand better the upstream and downstream effects of the business models. So if years ago, nobody talked about a full life cycle of a product, all of a sudden now you have the discussion, why did Tesla get a worse ESG rating than, ExxonMobil, etc.? So that actually drives a better understanding because people are curious. I think it also adds a bit of curiosity there. And I think that the crucial things that we need to change in terms of ESG reporting, this is something that we did as a research project with UNPRI and Thomson Reuters Foundation. The interesting thing is that currently most of the ESG data that we analyze and research is based on effort. So do you have a human rights policy? Yes. Do you measure carbon? Yes. But we actually don't look at the effect of these policies. So it's all very nice to do something, but actually let's get some meaningful data on the effect. And that is the hardest part because that needs to be based on science, which I think where things like the EU taxonomy, which has a lot of work that we're doing now on improving the guidelines and usability of the taxonomy. So that is absolutely crucial to drive the market uptake of that. But we do need to shift from the effort to the actual effect on the ground. And if we have maybe less indicators and a bit less data, that's not necessarily a bad thing. As long as that data actually helps us to price the negative effect, so price the externality. So in that sense, yes, let's put a price on carbon. Let's put a price on larger tax on natural resources. Let's actually maybe up the cost of water. So those are the kind of crucial things that we systematically need to address so that the depletion, so we don't have the privatization of the profit and socialization of the environmental cost across the society and different jurisdictions, or even sending it somewhere to a different jurisdiction because we've decided that we do not want it in our own country. So I think that actually helps. If you understand the disclosure along the supply chain, then you can tackle the worst offenders, seeing where they are doing the worst damage in terms of environment.
Great, and I can see that we're also broadening up a bit the scope of the discussion, which is only natural, and I think will lead us also maybe in a second step to some converging points. I'd like now to read another question that I found interesting that relates more strictly speaking to the argument that you've been making, Florian. So I'll read it out, and then we also pick up a second question, and then I'll run a poll to get us moving. So I think that the question by Stein Ferrari is the following. So does regulation, carbon tax, and I think he's referring to your argument, the design of this and the impact assessment of it not require measurement as well in form of ESG data? Could you elaborate maybe a bit on that, Florian?
Can you say that again? They don't need measure. You see, oh yeah, no, I get it. No. So yeah, I think that's we spend an insane amount of money for measuring actually and the reason is actually because we don't want a CO2 tax. And as I said, we have ESG disclosure, which will be, if we really do it the way a lot of actors would like to do, it would have a heavy cost on especially smaller companies. We do then measure we do have ESG rating agencies. They are very costly. We also we would need to actually to be really measure CO2 emissions, we would need not only scope 1, scope 2, but also scope 3. And we are very, very far from even pretending to be able to measure scope 3 in a good way. The way we do it is mostly proxies. So I do think, as you said, right, if we all had a CO2 tax, then we would not need to measure this because everything would be taken into account and would be internalized via the price. This is also the price is the mechanism that works best in our economy. It's very, there's loads of studies that the price mechanism is very transparent and yeah, it works. So I do think, I do think this would be by far the preferred choice, CO2 tax. And measurement, personally, I think we do it because we don't want the CO2 tax.
Okay, so I think there is a bit to follow up on, but not necessarily now on how you conceive the design of your carbon tax. That might answer also some of the questions that Stein has. Linda, would you like to comment on that, or shall we pick up another question?
I think let's pick up a couple.
Yeah, so maybe I would actually, I know the question is addressed to Florian, but let's start with you. Talking about the need for regulation, how do you see the impact of the EU proposal for the corporate due diligence regulation? It's another acronym that we mentioned. If we could elaborate on this, and perhaps Florian is not exactly familiar with the details of EU regulation being based in the US, so feel free also to tell us that you'd like to skip that question and we find another one. So Linda first.
I believe that what we've actually been seeing lately over the last 6 months is the big wake-up call that actually not only the CSDDD or the corporate due diligence directive is starting to have an effect. We also have to realize that at this point in time, these regulations are just about to start functioning. So once you start the reporting cycle, which I think starts with the CSRD in 2024, and then there is every year additional requirements on additional actors to report, the point is that we already are starting to see the first effect. So we hear from SMEs and projects that all of a sudden their clients and their investors are asking, oh, do you actually measure carbon? Do you know your carbon footprint? What are you doing on biodiversity? What are you doing about circularity? So on and so forth. So I think all of these particular regulations, they actually do work, but the reporting and the actual effect will only be visible in the next couple of years. And I believe there will be even more exciting research then. There's going to be a lot more PhDs talking about this. And I think that that will also lead to potentially a better design, understanding where the carbon leakage is. So I think that would actually help improve the implementation and the design of any carbon tax, because you do need to understand how the system works, where the worst offenders and the biggest emitters in the supply chain are. And I agree that currently it's all done on estimates, approximation, etc. But actually, if you do have to report something that then needs to be verified, and you need to know that that information is as accurate as possible, that does change things. And I think this is the way how the regulation will move. I think it's pretty much inevitable. It will be very difficult to stop it. Maybe there will be some political developments which will allow to delay something. But I think the direction of travel is very clear. From voluntary, we're moving to mandatory, and the screws are tightening in terms of the standards, the criteria, the definitions, etc. And with the growing understanding and much better capacity also in the civil society, so research institutes, think tanks, etc., they're much better equipped to lobby for more meaningful change. If you looked a few years ago, we didn't have enough sustainable finance, sustainability focused institutions. Now we do. And that also puts additional pressure on the actors to do something about it, because we can tap into the zeitgeist, we can tap into the frustration, and with the correct framing, I think we can push through even more tightening of the regulatory landscape.
Okay, thank you for that. Florian, did you want to engage on this question?
No, I prefer another question.
Okay, that's fine. So I realized that I actually skipped a question from the chat box, which was from Roberto Decour, directed at you, Florian, because he says that you said that ESG disclosure not necessarily converting change in management or consumers, and it is a cost that takes money out of innovation. So he's then questioning whether a lack of data and greenwashing wouldn't be more costly. And what do you reply to this?
Yeah, I mean, this is all, it all comes down to the question, will ESG disclosure prevent us from engaging in meaningful action, or will it enable us to engage in meaningful action? And I don't think this is not necessarily true. It might be I haven't lived in Europe in 6 years, so it might be Europe might be on a different path, but I certainly see that in the US here. And the US will be followed by a lot of other countries in the world as the economic leader in the world. And so I can see that there certainly is this, there's no will to engage actually in real regulation about climate change so far, not on the country level. On the state level, it's always different, right? In the US, it's really complicated here in the US. So I do think, yeah, and I think this is really the heart of the question. It's the same here, right? If we say that we will never achieve any regulation and we need ESG disclosure, and the whole sustainable investing and all those processes, then obviously greenwashing becomes a problem. But we wouldn't bother about greenwashing if you had a CO2 tax.
Okay, thanks a lot for this. I think that we've left a few things aside that we'd like to pick up on in a few minutes. But I'd like to, given your profile and your past research, Florian, there is this question that came up also in the registration about the reliance on ESG ratings. So I don't resist. The question is the following: how can we rely on ESG ratings in this space if they are very discordant with each other? And I know that would need to give you a time limit for that. So please, you have, let's say 2-3 minutes, not more.
So I think that there are two answers to that. There's the short-term answer and the long-term answer. The short-term answer, first of all, there's no shortcut. The short-term answer is a little bit a shortcut though. So what you can do is you buy several ESG ratings and you take an average, right? Because ESG ratings are some sort of an opinion, and you learned in high school, if you take an average of like certain data points, the errors cancel each other out. There are some problems involved because the errors are distributed differently, because certain ESG ratings have different objectives. Some are more short-termism, some are more long-termism. And so then you can use statistical models to get rid of the noise. But this is still very limited. What we really need also here is regulation about ESG rating agencies. And there are a couple of things that go a little bit wrong, and that is that we have more and more quasi-monopoly, especially here in the US, but also in Europe, of one ESG rater. And what we need is more competition around measurement methodologies to improve measurement practices. And here, I think the regulator should step in and enforce more transparency. So open up the methodology books, because some raters don't even have a methodology PDF. And then they're just selling the data with basically the names on the indicators or on the ESG rating. And then the other thing is more accountability. Firms often struggle really. They observe the ESG rating, they see how they rate it, and they don't agree, and maybe sometimes for good reasons, because there are also a lot of cultural differences. So if an American rater rates a European company, it might get something completely wrong. And so there should be an accountability mechanism where the firm reaches out and the rater has to listen to the firm. And if the criticism is valid, it has to take that into account. If it's not valid, then no, the ESG rater is the judge, so to say. That's actually, yeah. But the problem also with ESG raters is that we want them to be a shortcut. We want them to give us a single number of a company and then just integrate that in our portfolio and don't think about it. But this is not how it goes. If you integrate ESG into your portfolio, you have to think about it. You have to do your due diligence, and it is a long process. And that is unfortunately the answer. It's more effort.
Okay, thanks for that. Maybe rephrasing a bit the question to Linda, because I think in the framework of this seminar, perhaps a way to formulate the question would be whether ESG rating companies can help us act from, let's say, ESG disclosure to Paris Agreement impact, right? Can they be a helpful actor on the way to help us with basically navigating the huge amounts of data that will come in the future?
I do think they play a role. Currently, I think Florian's research shows very well all the things that are wrong with it. I do think that the European Commission DG ESMA's upcoming work on how to tackle ESG ratings agencies, conflicts of interest, variety of issues that have been identified will help. On the other hand, it is very interesting to see how practitioners actually use the different ESG ratings. As I mentioned earlier, there's a big global investment company that buys the data and the ratings from 8 or 9 different companies. Then they have a bespoke model where then they explore what the differences are. And they always try and identify the opportunities, so the best in class. And they also try to identify the ones that potentially are the biggest risk that they might not have foreseen. So actually, you can also exploit the discrepancies and the different methodologies. So it's not necessarily bad. It just depends how we use it. If we want to create ESG ratings and then use them for credit ratings and that kind of purpose, then of course it's a completely different question how we want to do it, what particular E or S, what the weighting is, how do we attribute it, etc. How do we measure it? Then it becomes different. If you are going to use ESG ratings for regulation, then it's a completely different question. And that's where I actually disagree with the point of we just need carbon price. I mean, if you still don't have a tighter regulation of how you measure and report your carbon emissions, then there's a lot of incentive on misreporting or messing with the numbers to make yourself look good and potentially pay a little less carbon tax. We've seen how with the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme, also there were flaws in the design. So I think actually designing these things properly and experimenting and then adjusting is absolutely key. And then it's a question how easy it is to do. So I think going forward, there's going to be a lot of discussion and a lot of political fighting. How do we get the design right so that we don't have unforeseen consequences and that we don't have adverse impact? And maybe going a bit more carefully sometimes is not a bad thing, but the main point is that we do need to do something. And I agree with the fact that we're running out of time. The Paris Agreement did set a timeline on it. And if you look at the carbon budgets and how we're doing at at reducing carbon emissions, we're not doing particularly well. And that is very scary.
Absolutely, and thanks for putting our minds back to the long-term objective, Linda. I think that we're going to have now a few results of one of the earlier poll. How useful? Yeah, exactly. So people were asked about the usefulness about ESG indicators on a scale of 0 to 5. Yeah, it's quite skewed towards being very useful, at least useful on the way. So you got, if you add 3 and 4, you reach, yeah, actually 3, 4, 5, you reach 90% of the answers. So I think that this seminar didn't contradict this message. I think that we're trying to put a bit more, let's say, meat and dimension about also the perverse incentives. And we're going to get to that, I hope, also when we reach the concluding remarks in just a few minutes. I think I would take up a last question. And here you have indeed the poll result 3 about also the enough data or too much ESG data and people are quite optimistic. Out of 46 respondents, 70% were saying that it should be enough. And some would say that it's already would already be too much. So we're not disclosing the composition of this group, but it's a general mix of public and private participants for your information, mostly public, however. So I'd like to move to the last question. And then again, we will give a chance to both Linda and Florian to go back to the, read the motion of this seminar. So the question by Adish Rakercha is, how can we tie business valuations and performance to environmental and or social impact? Would that not be more meaningful than disclosures? And here I'd like to ask you for, let's say, a minute answer each before we then conclude. Florian, before.
Linda, will you start?
Sure. I think it's something that I mentioned earlier. I think the business valuations and performance, business valuations, that is, I think, a work in progress. If you actually look at how valuable ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, etc., were 2 decades ago versus a decade, and how that value is changing is very, very interesting. It's also very interesting to see how much more capital expenditure they're trying to put, or at least signal that they are going green. So there is already some sort of re-evaluation in the system happening, maybe too slowly, but I think it's definitely happening with people wanting to invest actually in green. And then in terms of how do you tie the performance, I already mentioned, if you actually have KPIs, meaningful targets, good measurement, verified measurement, then you can tie the performance. And there are risks in it, of course, where people are faced with 2 conflicting aims, trying to drive financial valuation, financial performance, and environmental. And I think at one point it will also be upon shareholders and stakeholders to agree on the new model. How do we actually meet the 2 or have an acceptable approach?
Okay.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem, thank you, Pierre. I think the biggest problem with tying this performance is that we need better measurements for this. And the fact where I think about ESG is, for example, I talked about CO2 emissions, but I think discrimination is a good example. We talk about turnover, we talk about promotions, we talk about the gender pay gap, we talk about sexual harassment cases, but we truly want to know, these are all extreme cases, right? And so what we truly want to know is actually how historically disadvantaged groups within a company actually they really discriminated against on a day-to-day basis. But what we observe is this extreme events like sexual harassment, turnover, because turnover, leaving a company, is actually quite an extreme event. Like, people won't leave a company just like that. And so then if we then tie, or like any performance to it, for example, here we talked about CEO, right? Paid tying to that kind of performance, then the problem is that I'm scared that we really hit the target because the CEO will maximize this, or like will really look at this this key metric, but the true discrimination he might not care, right? And so we have this false sense of achievement, and I think this is a big source of, so to say, greenwashing, this false sense of achievement. Yeah.
Thank you, Florian. So with mindful of time, I think that we've reached the stage in which we will ask one final poll, which is actually the same one as the beginning. We will test everyone's change over an hour in terms of preferences and opinions. So again, the poll is a simple question about whether ESG disclosure will help us reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And then we'll comment briefly in a few minutes at the difference between the start and the end of this conversation. Now, I'd like to give you, Florian, first, and then Linda, 2 minutes for concluding remarks. Please, of course, refer to your original arguments if you'd like to restate them. But I'd like also to push you a little further and try and also point out to what extent you converged with some of the arguments that the opposite side brought up, so that in a final wrap-up, we can see whether there is anything where basically there is a compatibility of views between the two of you. So Florian, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Pierre. To be honest, Linda didn't have that much convincing to do. I think actually personally, I am for more disclosure. I am for disclosure of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. But what I wanted to, I took the role of the devil's advocate here because I think we miss crucial information. And especially the fact that I'm for ESG disclosure is very much based on assumptions that I can, as a researcher, and also if I was a policymaker, I cannot prove. And I think this is a very important thing, that in a field where I can feel that there's a lot of missionaries that want to do good, right? But we often take shortcuts. We want to do something, we want to achieve something, but we don't really look at the mechanism how we want to achieve it. And I'm really scared that this is happening. So I do have a lot of research focus on these problems that I was talking about, this missing knowledge between. And so basically my big takeaway here, for hopefully for those who listened, is that we still if we do that, there are major gaps in our knowledge of how we actually achieve real true impact, especially on regarding climate change. And that is, do we crowd out or crowd in a regulation? And also that actually those 3 impact journals, so in sustainable investing, the consumers or management, that they actually work. And it's not said that they do. I might totally, and we all might get it wrong. And so policy making, in my sense, should also be very much evidence-based. So we need more evidence here. Because wishful thinking can sometimes make things worse.
Thank you for that. Linda.
Yes, I completely agree with Florian that the one issue up until now definitely has been this green wishing, in the sense that, oh, I disclosed something, I got a high ESG rating, I've done enough. And then what we've seen in the real economy is that we don't have enough transition, we don't have enough capital flows flowing to transitioning businesses or green businesses. So I think what we need to end is the massive dichotomy of that currently exists in people's minds, where it's financially very profitable versus green. We still struggle with that. So what we need to do is rewire the system, in the sense that through for example, central banks, there is one tool asking for bigger capital requirements for example, having more green assets for banks. All of a sudden, banks would be much more incentivized to offer more loans and ask for more data. And then we can also talk about how to make these disclosures much more science-based and much more meaningful. So I think that altogether, it's a complete truth that we have currently conflicting incentives for investors and the financial sector, and even for businesses. And that's something that we need to change. We need to reward the green. We need to actually reward the fact that people are giving accurate disclosures. That already would be something very big. If you, for example, are having the best disclosures ever, you should get better financing conditions. And I think that also with ESG ratings and assessments and all of these very technical indicators, I think that there should be a race to the top. So if I can prove that my data is more accurate, better, science-based, well, then that should be rewarded, and that there should be a competition to be the best in class in terms of ESG data gathering and reporting. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree that the real economy, incentives and policy also needs to change to support disclosure and support meaningful transition, because just disclosure alone will definitely not get us to the Paris Agreement.
Fantastic, and thanks, Linda, for pointing at the data quality discussion, which I think is absolutely central. So this is a result. With ESG disclosure of Poll 4, actually we're quite close. Perhaps I can ask Chiara to put again in the chat the difference between the two, so that everyone has it. But meanwhile, I would like really to stress a few points where I think that there is quite some complementarity, and clearly this was a role play, and so in every role play, everyone needs to exacerbate some of their own positions or ignore some of their key arguments. Now, I consider that the argument about perverse incentives is absolutely central. I mean, it's important to have this in mind when designing regulation. To me, we're still at a stage where we're a bit wandering and testing the ground as to how the different bits and pieces of, let's say, in Europe, jurisdiction I know better, fit together. How will, let's say, the standards, the taxonomy, also the funding capacities, etc., in the future work together? Will also, what would be the pickup rate among institutional investors? What's linked to that also at the end of the day is a theory of change between the big objectives and actually impact. And I think that this is something that we're still exploring because we haven't seen happening at such large scale for a lot of time. We need more data, we need more research to understand really the mechanism that I think Florian and both Florian and Linda pointed out today. And I think that the disclosure and the taxation has been mentioned by, I think, Carlos in the chat box, is also something that that can play together if it's designed properly. And so to what extent can actually disclosure help us lay a groundwork that will be then developing metrics that work well, that are efficient, but to what extent can it be also a problem if we focus too hard on this? I think that we've discussed this today. We also talked about measurement issues and perverse incentives. Whenever you have a metric that gets politicized, I think it's really dangerous. And so it's important that we keep that in check, and that transparency is actually an exercise that is based on outcomes and not too much on intents. So I didn't want to be exhaustive in this summary, but I thought I'd just pick up on the few elements that both today fantastic speakers, engaging discussion provided to the table. And so there is, we've compared poll 1, the initial question, and poll 4, there was a 3 percentage point different in the number of people saying yes. So there was an effect also on the arguments that you provided, Florian. I don't think I will drag this further. It's been really great to have this very stimulating discussion with you and with the people in the call, in the seminar, who I hope took away the importance of not having too many shortcuts and thinking really well about the public policy objectives and also the mechanism who have been well, who are we supposed to be at play, but who will also be at play in the future. I will close this now, but I'd like to really thank everyone for this special moment together. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.